It was a city that shouldn't exist. In the middle of a salt lake, 200 kilometers from the nearest sea, a nation built its capital. When the Spanish conquistadors first sighted it in the 16th century, many of them, men hardened by war, thought they were dreaming or going mad. There, floating on the waters of the Valley of Mexico, was a vision of another world. White towers and temples that seemed to rise from the waves, gleaming under the sun. Bustling squares, larger than those in Spain, and an absolute silence, broken only by the sound of songs and the backwash of the water against the pavement. How was it possible? How had a civilization, which many in Europe considered primitive, dominated nature so completely? The answer lies not in the palaces or the temples, but in what sustained it all, an engineering feat so audacious that it defied the laws of physics and geography. This is the story of how a people saw, in an inhospitable swamp, the center of the world, and how, against all odds, he built it. To understand the miracle, one must understand the absurdity of the choice. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Mexica, whom history would know as the Aztecs, were a nomadic and homeless people. Warriors and pilgrims, they wandered the lands of present-day central Mexico, guided by a prophecy. They should found their city where they found an eagle, perched on a noble cactus, devouring a snake. The prophecy led them to one of the worst lands available, Lake Texcoco. Not an ordinary lake. Its waters were shallow, brackish, and unpredictable. In the summer, it overflowed with the rains. In the winter, it receded, leaving vast plains of mud. It was a hostile, swampy landscape, without stones to build on and without firm ground to plant on. Any other people would have seen there a sign to keep walking, but the Mexica, coming from a place called Aztlan, the land of the herons, saw in that aquatic landscape an echo of their own origin. They didn't see a swamp, they saw a natural fortress. Surrounded by shores occupied by powerful and hostile kingdoms like the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalcan, the water was not an obstacle, it was the only possible defense. There, nobody wanted them, and there, nobody would bother them. In 1325, on the small island of Mexico, they laid the first foundation. The problem is that to grow, they would need to create the ground beneath their own feet. The island was too small for a city. The solution? Steal land from the enemy, literally. This gave rise to the first major tension, the conflict between man and nature. The Mexica developed a unique system of cultivation and territorial expansion, the Chinampas. Imagine a gigantic floating jigsaw puzzle. They planted ayojote stakes, a water-resistant wood in the shallow bottom of the lake, delimiting long rectangles. On top of this structure, they wove a mat of reeds, and on top of that, deposited layers upon layers of fertile silt dredged from the bottom of the lake, mixed with decaying vegetation. The conflict here is against chaos. A chinampa is not an ordinary garden bed, it is a constant battle against erosion and dissolution. The rows of willows planted along the edges were not merely decorative, their roots intertwined, forming a living wall that held the soil and filtered the brackish water. The success was so overwhelming that the city began to expand into the lake, swallowing the water. But creating land was only half the battle. The other half was moving through it. And for that, they didn't build streets, they built canals. An intricate web of waterways crisscrossed the city. Goods didn't arrive by carts, but by canoes. Imagine the silence of a metropolis without wheels, where commerce, locomotion, and social life pulsed to the gentle rhythm of paddles on the water. In the heart of Tlatelolco, the great open-air market, canoes gathered, bringing cocoa, corn, hides, and gold from all corners of the empire. The city wasn't just built on the water, it breathed through it. But then the second great conflict arose: survival. How to supply drinking water to hundreds of thousands of people living in the middle of a salt lake. Rainwater wasn't enough. The solution was a masterpiece of engineering, the Chapultepec Aqueduct. Chapultepec means hill of the grasshopper. Pure fresh water sprang forth there. The challenge was to bring it to the island, kilometers away, over the salt water. Mexica engineers built a double layer of mortar and stone over the dike that connected the city to the shore. Above it ran an open, slightly inclined channel through which the water flowed by gravity. And why 2 layers? Because while one was being cleaned and repaired, the other maintained an uninterrupted flow. The city never ran dry. The last piece of this hydraulic puzzle were the elevated causeways. 3 large roads connected the island to the mainland, to Tlacopan, to Iztapalapa, and to Tepeyac. They were straight, perfectly level, and wide enough for 8 horsemen to pass side by side. But they weren't just roads, they were dams. Every few hundred meters, the sidewalks were intersected by wooden bridges that could be removed in seconds. If the city was attacked, these access points became traps. But Mexican ingenuity went further. They controlled the lake itself. Since Lake Texcoco had no natural outlet to the sea, the rains caused it to overflow, threatening to engulf the city. The Mexica built a monumental dike, the Nezahualcóyotl dike, separating the salt water on the east side from the fresh water on the west side, where the Chinampas were located. They didn't just live on the water, they tamed its moods, preventing floods and ensuring the harvest. What was once a small, hostile island inhabited by unwanted refugees became the nerve center of an empire. In the 15th century, Tenochtitlan was not just a large city, it was one of the largest on the planet, rivaling Paris and Constantinople in population and splendor. More than 200,000 people lived there. Some estimates reached 300,000, in a space that 200 years earlier was only water and reeds. The engineering that had been a tool for survival now transformed into an instrument of power. And power, in a warrior society like the Mexica, needed to be demonstrated at every turn. The canals, which once carried food to feed the population itself, now carried tributes from the hundreds of conquered cities. Gold, silver, precious stones, quetzal feathers, cacao, and cotton no longer flowed in humble canoes. They paraded in ornate vessels under the gaze of a population accustomed to seeing the world's wealth flow into the heart of the capital. The elevated walkways, the same ones that protected the city with their removable bridges, had been transformed into stages of military might. Along them marched endless lines of eagle warriors and jaguar warriors in their animal skin uniforms and feather uniforms, returning victorious from the flowery wars. The stone ground that was once a defense now echoed the weight of the conqueror's boots. And at the center of it all, dominating the horizon, the Templo Mayor was not merely a place of worship, it was the physical symbol of human triumph over primordial chaos. Each layer of stone superimposed on the previous one represented a new cycle of expansion, a new level of power. Legend had it that in the beginning, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, needed to defeat the 400 from the south so that the sun could rise. The temple was the embodiment of this myth, proof that where only darkness and water once existed, pyramids now stood. The city grew not only upwards, but also in influence. The canals that crisscrossed Tenochtitlan were the arteries of a body that now pulsed far beyond the lake. They connected the capital to cities like Texcoco, Tlacopan, and Xochimilco, forming a continuous urban sprawl around the lake. What archaeologists today call the Basin of Mexico was in the 15th century one of the most densely populated and intensely cultivated regions on the planet. Water, which had once been a limit imposed by geography, became the basis of hegemony. The Mexica had discovered that controlling water meant controlling life, and whoever controls life controls everything. Everything seemed to be under control. The machine functioned perfectly. The Chinampas produced 7 harvests a year, feeding a rapidly growing population. The aqueducts gushed forth fresh water uninterruptedly. The dikes kept the salt and fresh waters in their proper places. Tenochtitlan was a clock of absolute precision, where every gear, every canal, every causeway, every sluice gate worked in harmony with the others. But perfection, in history, is often only the prelude to downfall. On the horizon, the water began to change color. It wasn't a physical alteration, but an omen. The city was growing, and with it, its wealth. And wealth, in a world without banks or international treaties, only attracts one thing: hungry eyes. The same canals that brought tribute from the subjugated provinces also carried information, and the information that began to arrive in the last years of the 15th century was strange, fragmented, almost unbelievable. First came the accounts of the Pochteka merchants, those spies disguised as merchants who traveled throughout the empire. They spoke of strange floating constructions sighted on the beaches of the Gulf of Mexico. They were larger than any canoe ever built. They had enormous cloths stretched on very tall poles, cloths that filled with wind and moved those structures without oars. Then came the stories of the survivors from coastal villages, pale men with hair on their faces, covered in hooves of a gleaming metal. They rode enormous creatures, half man, half beast, unlike any they had ever seen before, and they carried objects that spat fire and thunder, killing from a distance without anyone touching the victim. For the Tlatoani Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the emperor who saw the world through the eyes of his priests and messengers, those accounts made no sense. They didn't fit into any prophecy, any code of war he knew. How could one prepare for an enemy that defied the categories of thought? The great Tenochtitlan, the city that mastered water and land, the metropolis that transformed an unhospitable swamp into the center of the known universe, was now a beacon of wealth in a sea of possibilities. And the curse of every beacon is that in the darkness it attracts not only the lost seeking shelter, but also the predators who see a target in the light. The engineering that built it, that complex network of canals, dikes, and causeways that tamed nature, would be put to the test in the most brutal way possible. The water that protected it, that nourished it, that defined it, would be its greatest challenge at the moment when the greatest threat in its history knocked on its paved doors. Would the canals, which for 2 centuries had guaranteed that the city would never fall, become traps? Would the causeways, with their removable bridges, be enough against war machines the Mexica had never seen? The question was no longer whether the city would survive nature. They had already won that battle. The question that now hung over the dark waters of Lake Texcoco, echoing in the silence of the deserted canals at night, was far more terrifying. Would the city survive man?